So think of your absolute favorite lead singer in a rock band.
Oh, that's a good place to start.
Right. Like just picture Freddie Mercury or Mick Jagger or whoever it is for you, just standing center stage right under the spotlight.
Belting it out.
Exactly. What is their primary job? If you really break it down, the contract we have with the singer is actually, pretty rigid.
It really is.
Their job is to hook you. They carry the melody, they deliver the emotion, and they basically provide that anchor that you sing along to in the shower or like tap your steering wheel to on your morning commute.
Yeah, it's basically the architecture of almost all popular music.
Right.
You can have the wildest guitar solos or, the heaviest drums, but the instruments are essentially just building a house.
Hmm.
The human voice is the person living inside that house, telling you exactly how they feel.
Right, but what if a singer decided that carrying a pretty melody was the absolute least interesting thing a human voice could do?
A total rejection of that contract.
Exactly. What if they wanted their voice to sound less like a person telling you a story and more like, I don't know, a dying steel mill?
Which is a wild concept.
It is. And that is the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring the career of David Thomas and his band, Pere Ubu.
Such an incredibly important
Yes, they
band.
really are. Our sources today break down how this one artist completely dismantled our expectations of what a frontman is actually supposed to do. He basically turned urban decay into a totally new musical language.
And in doing so, he essentially laid the bedrock for massive musical shifts.
Yeah.
We're talking about the birth of post-punk, the very origins of industrial music, and just a total reimagining of the avant-garde.
Not.
But it requires throwing out literally everything you think you know about a pop song.
It really does. So we're going to shortcut your understanding of how he achieved this, but I do want to warn you right up front, we are exploring a sound today that is not pretty.
No, not at all.
It's extremely unstable. It stutters, it mutters, it squeals.
It's abrasive.
Very. But leaning into this difficult sound provides this massive aha moment for anyone who's just, curious about where the boundaries of art actually lie.
Yeah, and to really understand why David Thomas's voice became this abrasive landscape, we can't just talk about music theory.
Right. It goes deeper.
Way deeper. We have to look at the literal physical geography that forged him, because you simply cannot separate this sound from 1970s Cleveland, Ohio.
And man, 1970s Cleveland was intense.
That's an understatement.
Right. So Thomas was born there in 1953, meaning he came of age right as the American Rust Belt was experiencing this severe, really traumatic economic decline.
The bottom was just falling out.
Exactly. This was a city built entirely on the back of the steel industry and heavy manufacturing. And in the 70s, that industry was literally actively rusting away.
I mean, the Cuyahoga River famously caught fire.
Right. The river was on fire. So the environment was entirely defined by urban noise, the thud of drop forges, the hiss of steam, the screech of metal, and just these massive, inorganic, decaying factory landscapes everywhere.
What's fascinating here is how Thomas actually processed that environment.
Right.
Because he wasn't just some kid passively absorbing the bleakness. He was a voracious reader of avant-garde literature. He was watching experimental cinema.
Which is such a contrast to the setting.
Totally. So let's define that really quickly. When we say avant-garde in this specific context, we're talking about art that intentionally throws out the rule book.
It rejects the normal structures.
Right. It rejects traditional narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas is consuming these highly abstract, fragmented art forms, all while surrounded by the constant grinding soundtrack of this collapsing industrial behemoth.
Wow.
And he didn't see those two things, the high art and the factory noise, as separate at all. The industrial ruins literally became the raw materials for his artistic philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack this because I think this is a crucial shift in perspective for you listening right now. At that time, in the mid-70s, pop music was largely about escapism.
Oh, heavily.
You had the pristine harmonies of the Eagles or, the shiny escapism of early disco.
Put on your dancing shoes and forget your troubles.
Exactly. People wanted music to take them far away from their grim realities. But Thomas does the exact opposite.
He leans right in.
Right. It's as if instead of trying to write a catchy tune to block out the factory noises outside his window, he decided to use the dying city itself as his primary synthesizer.
That is a great way to look at it. He didn't want to escape Cleveland. He wanted to play Cleveland like an instrument.
Yeah.
Because he was channeling this incredibly heavy industrial environment, the traditional rules of rock music just couldn't hold the weight.
They just snap.
Exactly. A standard, bouncy four-chord blues progression cannot accurately reflect the sound of a crumbling steel mill.
So if a standard rock band can't survive the weight of this whole philosophy, Thomas has to invent a totally new vehicle.
He does.
So how does he actually build that?
Well, he starts by joining a short-lived but totally legendary band called Rocket from the Tombs in the mid-70s.
Okay.
And this is what music historians often call a proto-punk band.
Wait, let me pause you there. It's 1975, right?
Yep, 1975.
The Ramones' first album isn't even out yet.
Not yet.
The word punk barely exists as a marketing term. So what does proto-punk actually sound like in Ohio at this specific time? Are we talking fast three-chord guitar songs?
No, not at all. It's much, much messier than that.
Okay.
It's aggressive, it's loud, and it's incredibly chaotic. It leans heavily on the pure noise of bands like the Stooges or the Velvet Underground.
Okay, so very raw.
Very. Our sources point out that Rocket from the Tombs wasn't just, teenagers making a racket in a garage.
Yeah.
They had a fully formed ideology.
They knew what they were doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The experimentation and the desire to break structures was baked in from day one. But the real structural explosion happens when that band splinters. And in 1975, Thomas forms Pere Ubu.
Which, by the way, even the name is a huge red flag for what you're about to hear.
Oh, yeah.
Pere Ubu is named after the main character in this 1896 avant-garde French play called Ubu Roi by Alfred Jury.
A class.
And it's this notoriously absurd, grotesque play that caused a literal riot at its premiere.
People were furious.
So by choosing that name, they are telling you right out of the gate, we are operating in the realm of the absurd, the theatrical, and the very uncomfortable.
And they absolutely delivered on that threat.
They really did.
By 1978, they released their debut album, The Modern Dance. This album is universally considered a post-punk monument.
And to define post-punk for just a second, if punk was the initial explosion that tore down the establishment rules of rock music with just fast, angry guitars.
Right, the demolition phase.
Exactly. Post-punk was the aftermath. It was the artists standing in the rubble, picking up the pieces, and realizing they could build something totally weird and structural with the wreckage.
Exactly. And The Modern Dance is just a masterclass in that. It's a fusion of bizarre synthesizer noise, totally non-linear song structures, and of course, Thomas's deformed vocals.
Right.
But let's look at the mechanics of how they actually did this, because it wasn't just random noise.
No, it was very calculated.
Think about how ordinary rock music works. It relies on a beat. A drummer plays a steady 4/4 rhythm that makes you tap your foot.
Yeah.
It has a verse, a chorus, a bridge. It is propelled forward.
Right. It takes you on a ride.
But Pere Ubu intentionally dismantled that propulsion. Instead of music acting as a progression from point A to point B, they presented these fragmented sound clusters.
Meaning what exactly? Like, what does a fragmented sound cluster sound like in actual practice?
Well, it means the drums might not play a groove at all.
Okay.
They might just crash randomly, mimicking the sound of falling sheet metal.
Wow.
And instead of a keyboard player playing a melody, you have a guy named Alan Ravenstein playing an early analog EML synthesizer.
But he's not playing notes, right?
No, he's not pressing keys. He's literally twisting knobs to manipulate raw electrical currents, creating these jarring, high-pitched oscillator sweeps that sound like a subway car braking.
That sounds intense.
It is. They established music as a static space, an existence, rather than a journey. You aren't riding a train to a destination. You are standing in a room while the walls shift violently around you.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay.
Because if I put myself in the listener's shoes right now, actually, I won't use that phrase. If the music intentionally refuses to move forward, if there is no driving beat, no chorus to sing along to, and it's just crashing metal and synthesizer squeals.
That's a tough sell.
Yeah, isn't that just static noise? Why would anyone actively engage with a song that outright refuses to take them on a traditional musical journey?
It's a very fair question.
I mean, if I go to a concert, I want to be entertained, not assaulted by shifting walls.
That sounds hostile. I know it does. But you have to shift your expectation from an auditory journey to an immersive environmental space.
Okay.
Think about it like this. When you walk into a dense forest, or better yet, a crowded, really noisy city intersection, you don't expect the sounds of the traffic and the sirens to have a catchy chorus or a narrative arc, right?
No, obviously not.
But you still experience it.
Yeah, that's true.
You exist within the complexity of that environment. Pere Ubu was creating sonic environments. They weren't trying to move you from the verse to the chorus. They were trying to drop you into a meticulously crafted atmosphere of urban tension.
So it's not a journey?
No, it's architecture.
Okay, that makes sense. And that concept, music as a static, immersive environment rather than a moving vehicle, that brings us directly to the absolute most jarring element of David Thomas's work.
His vocal.
His vocal delivery. If the band is creating the architecture, his voice is, well, it blurs every boundary.
Totally.
It exists somewhere in the muddy waters between muttering, talking, and screaming. But the real genius here is his motivation. Our sources make it so clear Thomas isn't singing to express personal emotion.
Which is the ultimate subversion of what a singer is supposed to do.
It really is. He isn't crooning about a broken heart. He isn't shouting about his political anger. He is talking to present a situation.
He's presenting a landscape.
Exactly. Instead of the lead singer being the star actor center stage delivering this passionate, tearful monologue, Thomas acts more like a completely detached tour guide.
Yes. But imagine that tour guide isn't even looking at you.
Right.
He's just wandering through the dark, pointing a flashlight at the strange, fragmented wreckage of the city around him, muttering to himself about a rusted gear on the ground.
While the rest of the band creates the sound of the collapsing factory right behind him.
Exactly. He's observing, not confessing.
But hold on, isn't emotion the entire point of music? If I go to a rock show and the front man is just muttering at a rusted gear, I'd probably feel cheated.
A lot of people did.
Really? How did audiences actually react to this back then?
Well, a lot of people were totally baffled. Some outright hated it,
I can imagine.
but others were completely mesmerized because it was so utterly foreign. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how this reverses the entire foundational premise of rock music we talked about at the very beginning.
Right.
The voice is no longer the emotional center of the universe. The voice has been demoted or elevated, depending on how you look at it, to act as just another piece of the environmental noise.
It's just a texture.
Yes, it's placed in the exact same hierarchy as the synthesizer squeal or the drum crash.
And liberating the human voice from the strict constraints of having to carry a melody that had this massive ripple effect.
Huge.
When you look at the history of alternative music, this approach influenced icons everywhere.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
You look at David Byrne of Talking Heads.
Yeah.
That jerky, anxious, kind of spoken word meets Yelp style of delivery. Or Marky Smith of The Fall, who practically built an entire career on rhythmic muttering.
They definitely took notes.
They took huge notes from what David Thomas was doing in Cleveland. He showed them that the voice could be a rhythm instrument, it could be a texture, it could just be a chaotic element of the environment.
It's a total paradigm shift. And it naturally leads to the evolution of genres like industrial music, which took that idea of using mechanical, factory-like sounds and turned it into an entire subculture.
Totally.
But think about what happens to the live performance.
Okay.
Once you strip away the melody and you abandon traditional linear song structures and you demote the singer from being a pop idol to being an environmental texture, a live concert can no longer just be a band standing there playing their hits.
Right, because there are no hits in the traditional sense.
Exactly. The entire concept of performance has to evolve.
Which is exactly what we see as we move into the 1980s. Thomas starts focusing pretty heavily on his solo work, though he would eventually restart Pere Ubu in 1990 and keep releasing music for decades.
Right.
But during this 80s solo period, he introduces heavy theatricality. He starts bringing deep narrative elements into the fold.
It becomes almost like a play.
Yeah. The lyrics were no longer just accessories hanging onto a beat. They became structural components of the piece.
The stage transformed from a venue where a band played songs at an audience into a theatrical space where abstract narratives unfolded.
It was performance art.
It really was. But because of this, his work is almost universally labeled as difficult.
Yeah, that word comes up a lot.
It intentionally distanced itself from mainstream commercial success. It demands a massive amount of work from the listener.
It does. It asks you to pay attention to the ugly parts, the disjointed parts. And I think that's why it stayed largely underground.
This raises an important question, though, about how we actually judge the value of art in music.
What do you mean?
Well, we live in an era where we often equate value with popularity or streaming numbers or how accessible something is.
That's true. Think about how we consume music today.
Right.
How often do you, listening right now, just throw on a Spotify playlist in the background while you're doing the dishes or answering emails?
All the time.
We use music as audio wallpaper.
Exactly. And our sources make a really profound point about this music that is difficult to understand in its own time often becomes the foundational language of the next era.
Oh, that's fascinating.
The ideas that David Thomas was wrestling with In 1978, treating the recording studio as an instrument, using abrasive noise as a texture, abandoning linear verse-chorus structure, those are standard practices in experimental and electronic music today.
Wow.
The difficulty people felt wasn't because the music was bad. It was just the friction of something entirely new entering the world.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah.
When we zoom out and look at this entire deep dive, the ultimate takeaway for you is that the difficulty of this music isn't about an artist just being pretentious.
No, not at all.
The dissonance, the muttering, the lack of a clear beat, it's an intentional tool. Thomas is using that friction to stop you from treating music purely as passive entertainment.
It's a wake-up call.
Exactly. When a song is catchy and easy, you can ignore it. You can do your dishes. When a song is difficult, it forces you to engage. You have to actively reckon with it.
It forces music to be a medium that actually stimulates your brain.
It demands your presence. The analysis we've been looking at perfectly summarizes this by describing David Thomas and Pere Ubu not just as a band, but as an ideological apparatus.
I love that phrase.
Right. They looked at the economic and physical decay of Cleveland, the resting factories, the collapsing infrastructure, and instead of letting it crush them or trying to write happy songs to just ignore it, they processed it.
They digested it.
They turned the decay into a new art form.
They took the rust and made it avant-garde. They transformed music from a product that you merely listen to into a three-dimensional landscape that you actually feel.
It proves that art doesn't have to be conventionally beautiful to be profound.
Definitely not.
Sometimes the most accurate reflection of the modern human experience sounds like a screeching synthesizer and a disjointed, muttered poem. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We spent this time talking about how difficult, non-linear music like David Thomas's forces us to actively feel and engage rather than just passively consume.
Right.
So think about your own daily environment. If you applied that same attentive, active mindset to the harsh, everyday noise of your own modern city, the sirens, the construction clatter, the hum of traffic outside your window, how might that change the way you experience the world around you? What if that noise isn't an interruption to your day, but just a different kind of landscape waiting to be explored?
Finding the structure in the chaos, it entirely changes how you walk down the street.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the soundscapes you encounter every day. And remember, the next time you see a lead singer step up to the microphone, don't just wait for the melody.
Listen for the landscape.
We'll catch you next time.